Happy New Year, everyone. Let's hope 2021 is by far a better year than the last. Unfortunately, mine is off to a rough start. I'm pretty darn sick, so I've asked Carmen Carrion to narrate today's second story. I hope you don't mind. Also, I'll be trying to put together a Scariest Stories of 2020 video as soon as possible. So please let me know in these comments which stories from 2020 that I've read were your favorite. Links to these stories in particular would be helpful too. Thank you. Now, today I've got some scary cabin in the woods stories to start the year off creepy. Enjoy, and remember to send your stories to us at darkstories.org. Let's begin. Paranormal Cabin from KM8642. This incident happened in November 2018 at a cabin in the Adirondack Mountains in New York State. The cabin is located in a private camp owned by my alma mater. There are about 10 cabins on the property, each of them isolated and private. I've been going to this camp for 30 years, and before this trip, I've never had anything odd or supernatural happen to me. Attending this trip was just me and my 16-year-old daughter. It was her first time there. We arrived mid-afternoon. The cabin we rented was about a quarter-mile walk from the parking lot. It sits in a pretty glade surrounded by the forest, and a small path runs past the cabin and continues on into the woods towards the next cabins. The cabin's construction is extremely rustic, made wholly of logs hewn from the surrounding forest. There's a porch that is covered with a wood railing. To the left on the porch is a wood rack built up against the railing. This is an important detail for later. The main room has a large stone fireplace and hearth. There's a couple couches, a dining table, and a galley kitchen. The only water source is a 10-gallon plastic container situated to the left of a sink that's set in the middle of the counter against the wall. The bedrooms are in a separate section behind where the fireplace is. Each bedroom has 2 single beds, one against the wall on the left and one against the wall on the right. There's a window between the beds. After unloading all our supplies in the cabin, we went outside to chop wood, as the cabin is without heat or electricity. Light is provided by propane lanterns. After a sweaty half hour, we had enough wood split to last at least 24 hours. It was already getting dark as we loaded the wood inside on the stone hearth next to the large fireplace. The excess wood we placed in the wood rack on the porch. We enjoyed our first night, eating a roasted chicken we'd bought at the store. I built a fire in the fireplace and kept feeding it until there was a nice bed of coals. We turned one of the couches around to face the fire, then sat down and read our books while intermittently chatting. It was very peaceful. The only sound the crackling of the burning wood, and the warmth of the fire was soothing. We went to bed early and got a great night's sleep. After breakfast the following day, we went for a short hike on the property. I showed my daughter a few of the other cabins in which I'd stayed in the past. It was a cloudy fall day, a bit chilly and windy. We got back to the cabin around noon. I fed the fire to get some heat going, then we had sandwiches for lunch. We sat on the couch in front of the fire and enjoyed the silence for a while. Once again, each of us reading our books. This is where the story gets interesting. Out of nowhere, we heard a sound behind us, outside the cabin. To me, it sounded like one of the logs on top of the wood rack on the porch had rolled. Just picture the sound a heavy round log would make if you rolled it across the top of other logs. My daughter and I immediately looked at each other. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Yes," she said. She pointed towards the back of the cabin, which was odd because I'd heard the sound coming from the front where the porch is. I figured it was probably just the acoustics of the cabin. My first thought was that it was some kids from one of the other cabins just messing around. Remember, there's a footpath that runs closely past our cabin. I thought someone walking by decided to mess around with us. We both stood up and I looked out the window towards the path. I didn't see anyone. I looked at my daughter and saw some fear and confusion on her face. I said to her, "I better take a look outside." For protection, I picked up a long, thin split log from the hearth, easy to swing at someone if necessary. With more than a little trepidation, I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind me. I took 2 steps and stopped. I looked first to the left, and all I saw was grass and forest. I then turned to the right, where the wood rack was. What I saw changed my life. It all happened so fast, a matter of a few seconds. When I turned, I saw something hovering above the wood rack, exactly where I thought the sound had come from. It's hard to describe. It actually looked like an octopus's tentacle, but a foresty version of it. Light brown on top with white spots and white underneath. But it did not look solid. It was like a phantasm, glowing and shimmering. The instant I saw it, it pulled back and was gone around the side of the cabin. It was as though it knew I'd seen it, so it quickly pulled its tentacle back. I've often read stories where people say they were so scared they couldn't move, and I always think, come on, you're in danger, move, what's your problem? Well, I now know why they don't move. They literally can't. I was so scared it was like my feet were nailed to the porch. My entire body went numb. My brain was telling me I should jump off the porch and run around the corner of the cabin to see what this thing was. But my body would not move. After a minute or two, I got enough courage to move. I turned around and I went back inside. I felt pale and flushed, as if I'd seen a ghost, which I guess I had. My daughter was standing there looking at me, and she could tell something had happened. I saw something, I said. Her eyes got bigger. "What did you see?" she asked in a shaky voice. I told her. I was nervously tapping the piece of wood against my leg. I walked over to look out the window again. I was trying to act normal and brave so my daughter didn't panic. I still didn't see anything. "I better go walk around the cabin to see if I find anything," I told her. "Stay here." I walked outside again and closed the door. Although I was still terrified, I knew I had to at least do a full circle around the cabin to reassure myself, and especially my daughter. I stepped off the porch and onto the ground. I went right, towards where I'd seen the phantasm. I poked my head around the corner of the porch. Nothing. I did notice, however, that on the ground right next to where the wood rack is on the porch, there were a bunch of twigs and a small branch or two, meaning if a person or animal had been standing on the ground next to the porch, I would have heard twigs snapping. And yet, I had heard nothing. There's no way an actual being had stood there. Gaining a little confidence, I proceeded to walk around the cabin, inspecting the ground and the surrounding area. Not a single thing was out of place. Not a footprint to be found, nothing disturbed. I walked back into the cabin and told my daughter. "Well, there's nothing out there," I said. "I guess that's good." She nodded tentatively. I restoked the fire and told her to sit with me on the couch. We propped our feet up on the hearth and soaked in the warmth, lost in our thoughts. She then asked me, "Do you think we should leave?" I thought about that. I understood her concern, but I honestly didn't think we were in danger. If she insisted she was too scared to stay, I'd pack up and leave, but I didn't want to. I don't think so. If it was something that meant us harm, it would have attacked me. This seemed to mollify her. We sat a while more, then I noticed it was twilight outside. I lit a few of the lights that are mounted on the wall, and I said, "Why don't we make dinner? I'm starving." She kept reading for a bit while I worked in the kitchen. There were plates in the drying rack on the counter that I put away. I then noticed a large puddle of water sitting on the counter to the right of the sink. The container of water on the counter was on the other side of the sink. It was way more water than a few drying dishes would cause, but I just figured I must have spilled some water as well. I took a towel and mopped up all the water. I filled a pot with water and put it on the stove to boil to make pasta. The boxes of dry goods we'd brought were on the small table against the wall. I grabbed for a box of pasta, and at first it wouldn't budge, like it was stuck to the table. I finally lifted it up and I saw water dripping from the bottom. I felt around and the box was soaking wet. I then checked the other boxes on the table and they were all wet as well. There was a large puddle on the table. This was a real head-scratcher. As I mentioned, there is no plumbing in the cabin, so no running water. I called my daughter over and showed her the table, and I also told her about the puddle near the drying rack. She was just as confused as I was. We looked under the sink. Nothing there. I checked out the plastic water container, but there were no leaks in it. I used a flashlight and examined the wall above the counter, but nothing. I checked out the ceiling as well. Once more, nothing. We'd been there 24 hours, and there had not been a single drop of rain. There were no drips coming from the ceiling. Besides, the roof is slanted, so it's not like there'd be standing water up there. We cleaned up the water and wrote it off as an oddity. We cooked the pasta, heated up some sauce, and had a tasty meal. We relaxed at the table for a bit, then began cleaning up. I brought the dishes over to the sink and placed them there. I caught a reflection coming off the counter to the right of the sink and leaned closer. No way. There was once again a large puddle of water there. I called my daughter over and showed her again. We were both absolutely perplexed. I mopped it up again and forgot about it. To this day, I have no idea how the water got there. There's no rational explanation. But that isn't the end to the story. We went to bed, both of us still rattled from the day's unnerving events. As a precaution, I placed a metal folding chair against the door to the cabin, figuring it would topple over and make a lot of noise if someone opened the door, as the door had no lock. We eventually fell asleep. My daughter was lying with her head at the far end of the bed, closest to the wall, which is an outside wall. I lay with my head in the opposite direction, closest to the inside wall. After a fitful sleep, I awoke around 7 a.m. The cabin was freezing cold, as the fire had died hours before. I knew I had to get up and start the fire and get some heat in the cabin. But it was warm and cozy in my sleeping bag, so I just lay there for a few extra minutes. Suddenly, I heard a scratching sound coming from the corner of the room where my daughter lay. It sounded like someone had a sharp metal pole and was dragging it along the outside of the cabin. Even weirder, the scratching sound was moving along the wall, in my direction, and as it moved, it gradually got louder until it filled the entire room and felt, to me, like a physical force. It went all the way across the outside wall and then turned the corner. Then it came all the way across to the wall behind me. I was lying with my back to the wall. When the scratching stopped, it felt as though it was precisely at the midpoint of my back. The entire sequence had taken about 5 seconds. My daughter did not wake up. When it stopped directly at my back, I lay there frozen. I began praying to Jesus to not let me get hurt. Whatever this thing was, it seemed focused on me. I have no idea why. In the 30 seconds I lay there praying, I didn't hear a sound nor feel anything on me. But it was as terrifying a 30 seconds as I've ever had. Finally, after about 5 minutes, I found the nerve to sit up. At that point, my daughter woke up. I asked if she had heard the scratching, and she looked at me like I was crazy. She obviously hadn't. I told her what I'd heard. We made ourselves a quick breakfast, straightened up the cabin, and got the heck out of there. I didn't relax until we were in the car driving home. As we checked out, though, I did ask the camp manager if they'd ever had reports of anything paranormal in the cabin we'd stayed in, or any other for that matter. He said no. To my frustration, some of the people I've told this story to have not believed me. I attest that every word of it is true, and my daughter is a witness. I was not drinking or doing drugs. I was 100% lucid. I haven't been back to that camp since then. I do plan to head back soon, staying in a different cabin. And if something else happens, I'll be sure to let you know.
The Cabin, from Anonymous. It was the middle of winter time, early January, I believe. This time of year, right after Christmas, we usually get quite a bit of snow. 2 cousins and I decided to go on a trip and stay in a cabin for the weekend. We had a family member who owned a cabin toward the mountains, and we decided it would be a nice getaway. We would head up there on Thursday night and return home that Saturday morning. The family who owned the cabin had warned us about strange sightings and things that had happened at the cabin. They claimed their young son had been standing at the kitchen window and was pointing outside. When the mother asked him what was the matter, he had told her there was a woman standing outside. There had been no one there. All 3 of us, being skeptical, decided to go anyway and have a good trip. If a woman outside was the most harm to come, we really didn't see a problem. There was also a weather forecast of a winter storm coming in, but we all 4 had 4-wheel drives and knew how to drive in the snow. Nothing, we decided, would stop us from a weekend of relaxation at the cabin. We had all of our stuff packed with enough food and drinks to last us a weekend, and were soon on our way. We finally made it to the cabin. It begun to flurry snow, but we figured it would make us more cozy at the cabin anyway. There was firewood for the fireplace, and we had remembered the hot chocolate and coffee. We got settled in and were relaxing at the fire we had built. The wind had begun to howl, and the snow was now an inch deep outside. Believing this was as bad as the weather would get, we relaxed for a few hours. We talked and laughed and were having a good time. After several hours, we all decided to go to sleep. That night's sleep was the best I had slept in a long time. I don't know what it is about sleeping in a cabin that just gives you a warm feeling. I remember waking that morning to a wonderful smell of sausage and eggs and bacon. You could almost hear it sizzling, the smell was so strong. I rolled over and decided to have a cup of coffee, and see if whoever was cooking needed some help. I was met in the hall by my cousin. We will call him Joe. "Wow," Joe said, "I am starving. That kitchen smells amazing. But when we entered the kitchen, not a soul was around. There were no eggs, bacon, or sausage frying. The stove was turned off, and it looked like the pans had not even been touched. We wrote this off as the strange things that tend to happen at this cabin. "Well," said Joe, "if there is a ghost here, I sure wish we hadn't just imagined that breakfast." We laughed and vowed not to say anything about it. People would just think we were crazy anyway. About that time, we heard someone come through the door. We will call this person Charles. "It has come a blizzard outside. Probably a good idea if we try to crank these trucks up. If it gets much worse, we will have to head out sooner, and a dead battery is not good," said Charles. Now we had all come in 3 pickups. All 4-wheel drive, and not an issue with any of them. The 3 of us grabbed our keys and walked out to start the trucks. My ignition rattled but would not start up. It was then that I heard the other 2 trucks struggling to start and then silence. After checking all of the trucks, it seemed there was nothing wrong with any of them. Irritated and wondering what on earth we were going to do, we all walked back inside. There was a phone inside the cabin, and we decided to call and see if a buddy might make their way up and give us a lift. The phone line was silent, though. No dial tone. "What are we going to do?" asked Joe. "Well," I answered, "the last thing we want to do is let this fire go out." Charles decided he would go out to the woodshed and bring in plenty more firewood, and then we would see about eating something. We were too far from town to walk back, so all we could do is hang tight. At least until we could figure something out. After a few minutes, Charles came back in shouting, "Hey! We may have neighbors!" Now, I had never heard talk of anyone living close by, so I asked what he was talking about. Charles claims he was out at the woodshed and heard a giggle. When he turned, he saw someone walking in the snow. When she turned around, he said it was a woman. He said she turned and walked around the other side of the woodshed and was gone. We all went out to see which way she might have gone. When we got to the woodshed in the area Charles had said he seen her, there were no footprints. Now, the snow by this point was about 5 inches deep. I have never seen anything walk through snow that deep and not leave a print. We all called Charles crazy and laughed it off. Deep down, though, I believe we were all 3 wondering what the heck was going on. The rest of that day passed, and we all went to sleep hoping the next day would come with better luck. I woke the next morning to grease sizzling and the same glorious smell coming from the kitchen. Again, I would find the kitchen empty and simply pour myself a cup of coffee. Joe and Charles walked into the kitchen about the same time and grabbed a cup of coffee too. "Truck still won't crank," Joe said. We all sat in the living room at the fireplace for a while trying to figure out what to do. It wasn't like we didn't have people who knew we were there. So we decided if Sunday came and we hadn't come home, someone would come looking for us. This day passed just as the first, and finally it was nighttime. We were still sitting in the living room when we all 3 heard what sounded like footsteps coming from the kitchen. I got up and walked toward the kitchen. It was empty. No one was there. We all turned in for the night, hoping that someone may show up later the next day when we didn't show up at home. Sunday morning, my eyes flew open. Once again, the aggravating smell of breakfast that I knew would be there. I walked into the kitchen and was joined by Joe and Charles. "What do you think?" asked Joe. "Try the trucks?" I simply nodded and we all walked outside. I put the keys in the ignition, not really even hoping at this point that it would start. The engine revved and my truck was running. I heard the other 2 trucks crank as well. All 3 of us looked at each other, equally shocked. 2 days had gone, and now all of a sudden all 3 trucks are running. We didn't even turn them off. We ran into the cabin, grabbing and throwing everything in no particular order into the trucks. We just wanted to get the heck out of there. I was focused on loading up when I heard Charles say, "Look, in the window." I looked up and stared in shock. In the kitchen window looking out at us was a woman. She had long brown hair and seemed to be wearing a nightgown. She was quite pretty and appeared to be waving at us. We all shared silent looks. That was all it took. We finished loading up and all jumped in our trucks and started down the mountain, not looking back. To this day, we don't really understand what happened, why 3 trucks seemed to stop running, and on this Sunday we were set to leave, all 3 trucks fired right up. And the woman? Whoever she was, we have told people what happened. Some believe us, some think we just came up with a good campfire story. When we told the owners about the woman, they nodded and said that she is there quite often. Today the cabin is no longer there. It was sold, and I have heard it finally was burned. As far as what still lingers on the land, I don't know that either. Do things stay there when places are gone?
The following are older stories about cabins that some folks might not have heard yet. Enjoy. Grandpa's Best Friend, from Mythology Loves Horror. The hunting cabin was just as I remembered it. It was tiny, hardly bigger than a tool shed, and after a year of neglect, dust now coated every surface. I hadn't been there in almost 10 years, not since the last time I went hunting with my grandfather Sebastian. I'd been so terrified by the thing we saw in the woods there that I hadn't wanted to return, and my parents just assumed I was too bored to want to spend 2 weeks with the boring old man. But Gramps still came to visit us. Thankfully, we never went there. When Gramps passed away a year ago, he left the cabin and the 30 acres surrounding it to his only remaining grandchild. At 20 years old, I had never expected to set foot on the rural mountainside again, much less inherit it. But a bad breakup had left me with the decision of moving into the cabin or into my parents' basement. The choice had almost been hard to make. The local newspaper, the Village Times, had claimed that Gramps died of a bear attack while out chopping firewood behind his cabin. I didn't really buy that story though, and even as I pulled my beat-up old Ford into the unpaved driveway, I had my hand on my rifle. Though if that thing came back, I was sure it wouldn't do much to it. But still, it made me feel better. I hadn't seen it in a decade, but if that creature was still out there, I would be prepared this time. At least I hoped. Several hours later, I was unpacked, and the cabin was decently clean. All of the utilities were still hooked up, and the refrigerator was well stocked. I had taken the week off of work to adjust to my new life, and I was planning on just relaxing for the next few days. My first night and day passed uneventfully, but by the second night, things were getting a little weird. I had spent enough time in the country as a child to be familiar with the wildlife here. Raccoons, skunks, bears, other mammals. But the freshly made claw marks on the side of the cabin, they weren't anything that I recognized. I woke up on my 3rd morning to gouges in the wood, and I was definitely unnerved. They were too large to belong to any small critters, and far too high up to be from coyotes. They were even too wide to be a mountain lion or bear. In this neck of the woods, that ruled out everything logical. As I studied the claw marks, I wondered how I could have slept through them being made. They definitely hadn't been there when I first arrived, and the fresh marks stood out in a bright contrast to the weathered wood of the cabin walls. I supposed a human could have made them with a knife, but I didn't have neighbors for miles. Who would be skulking around out here just to prank me like this? It didn't make any sense. It crossed my mind that maybe my ex might have done it, just to freak me out. But Sandra lived almost 50 miles away and did not have the address for the cabin in the first place. I don't use social media enough to bother listing my new address, and we didn't have friends in common or anything like that. I eventually shrugged it off, deciding to let it go. I knew that worrying about it wouldn't help. That afternoon, though, I found myself driving the 10 miles into town and buying some motion-activated floodlights and a motion-sensing camera. 2 more nights passed, and each morning, I woke up to the claw marks getting closer and closer to the cabin door. As much as I wanted to believe it was a prank, I had to admit to myself that the evidence was overwhelmingly against that idea. The floodlights would turn on, and the camera would snap, yet somehow, all I would ever see in the photos was an empty yard. I had even tried to set up a video on my phone, but all it managed to capture was a vague blur of movement at the edge of the screen. I had enough. On the 5th night, I went outside, rifle in hand, settling comfortably on the porch steps. There was no noise, no sound to indicate that the usual nocturnal critters were up and about. I shut all the lights off and waited for the creature that I knew would come. Hours passed, and as 1 a.m. rolled around, I snapped myself out of a doze. I could hear something moving quietly out by the edge of the woods, where I could make out a figure skulking about, its features hidden in the shadows. As the animal drew closer, I rubbed my eyes in disbelief, because there stood Sebastian, my supposedly dead grandpa. He wasn't wearing any clothes. He paused mid-step, his head slowly turning to face me, probably hearing me gasp from shock. Grandpa looked sickly, with skin pale and ribs visible. He was bald now, his once Santa-like beard and hair gone. "Grandpa?" I called out. I could hear the quiver in my own voice, and my hands were shaking from terror. The rifle had fallen to my lap, nearly forgotten in the intensity of seeing my presumably dead grandfather. I'd been so convinced that what I was about to see would be that antlered creature that I saw years ago, the one I knew killed Sebastian. But I never considered once that my grandpa was still alive. "Grandpa, what are you doing? Come inside." Tears were streaming down my cheeks. I didn't care what my grandfather had been doing this whole time or why he was out there. All I cared about was that he was still alive. I wanted to hug him again. Run, you stupid boy. It's coming." His voice barely sounded human anymore. His voice came out all wrong, and before I could respond, Grandpa was bounding into the woods on all fours. He was gone in the blink of an eye, the bushes hardly swaying where he had passed through. The woods remained as eerily silent as they had been before, even though my grandfather's retreat should have made a large amount of noise. Not a second later, a low growl came from behind me, the sound reverberating off the cabin walls. A massive creature, the one that I remembered, approached from the side of the cabin. Within seconds, it became clear to me that it wasn't a human or an animal, unless someone was wearing an amazing and terrifying costume. The creature was every bit as surreal as I remembered. Long, pale limbs sprouted from an emaciated torso. An ivory deer skull shined in what little moonlight managed to bleed out through the clouds. It was wearing ragged old buckskin leggings and had beads around its neck. I could not see its eyes though, but I knew without a doubt that if it had any, it was staring directly at me. I knew not whether it was a Wendigo or a skinwalker or something else, but it didn't matter. It was here. Before I could take in any more detail, the creature began to laugh, a guttural sound that echoed in my head hauntingly. It was laughing so hard at me that it nearly doubled over. I realized that its limbs were able to wrap around its body almost twice. I raised my rifle, firing several times at it point blank, all of those rounds lodging firmly into the creature's neck and torso. The being looked down at its new piercings. Then, without a problem, almost comfortably, it began to dig out the bullets at an unhurried pace. It dropped them onto the ground like a child plucking flower petals, and it seemed to sigh in irritation as it dug out the final one.
Pointless.
It just spoke. What was going on? What did this thing want? Did Grandpa always know about this horrendous-looking thing? My head began to ache with the strain of trying to understand all this. It seemed to sigh as if annoyed by the bullets. It then lifted its claw and pointed it at the cabin.
Inside. Go.
I was all I could get out in reply to this thing speaking to me. I blinked profusely, and the next thing I knew, the monster was gone, and standing there was Rufus, my Grandpa Sebastian's best friend. Rufus had been around as long as I could remember, and had always been a kind old man. He supposedly lived on the other side of the mountain, even though I'd never actually seen his house, let alone been to it. Rufus just always sort of appeared out of nowhere, often startling us so badly that we had almost shot him a few times.
What in tarnation you doing out here, whippersnapper?
Rufus? Am I dreaming?
Nah, you're not dreaming. But you need to get inside before that thing comes back. That thing that looks like your grandpappy.
I was shaking so tremendously from fear that I could barely move my limbs at the time, but I managed to navigate the steps. I'm not entirely sure why I obeyed Rufus after seeing that thing, but after seeing Rufus's familiar face, there was something calming about it, making this insane situation more easily dealt with. I needed some semblance of normalcy in that moment, so I went about my usual pre-bed routine, ignoring the fact that nothing made sense anymore. Mindlessly, I made sure all the windows and doors were locked. I took a long hot shower to relax myself. I crawled into bed, my adrenaline finally calming down. I think I was in shock. I noticed I was repeatedly reassuring myself that I would wake up and everything would be as it should be. Just writing this down was hard enough. I have no idea, no ounce of understanding for what went on that night at the cabin. I'm more confused than I ever thought possible. Who really was Rufus? And what was that thing that looked like my grandpa? The House and the Cabin, from KaijuuArcadia. When I was 14 years old, me and my girlfriend went to my grandparents' house. We agreed to actually do a test of courage in the middle of the night, an excuse to go explore some abandoned and creepy places. We asked my grandpa if he knew of any places like that. He told us about an old abandoned house and cabin at least a kilometer south of where we were. He said that the house was owned by a man from Ohio named Derek Shod from the 1900s, but he suddenly disappeared and was never heard from again. We were skeptic of this story. My girlfriend and I weren't very strong believers of these kinds of things, so we decided to go to that location, not entirely spooked by that story. My grandparents didn't want us to go, but like teenagers, we disobeyed. We ended up sneaking away and running off in the middle of the night, searching for that house and cabin to the south. The only thing we had on us were 2 knives, 2 flashlights, and a few extra batteries. As we were searching, I could feel that the forest had eyes and ears. The entire way through, it was like someone was following us, watching us closely. When we finally found the house and cabin, a sudden cold breeze blew, giving us chills straight up our backs. We entered the house first. We found a lot of creepy things, like books about demons and witchcraft, strange graffiti that we didn't understand, some very weird paintings, and worst of all, at least to me, a bunch of dolls in every room we entered. The house was only a common American house. That's the way I'd describe it, as I'm from the Philippines. We were scared now, but we were still ready to see that cabin. So we exited the house and cautiously made our way over to the wooden cabin. It was about 50 or 60 feet away from the house. While I was walking behind my girlfriend, I heard a strange voice. "Over here. I'm here." I stopped right then and there, looking around, trying to find what called me. All I saw was a small bulge of cement. I approached it and then just stopped. I couldn't help myself but stop at that position. All I remember after that was complete blackness. Apparently, I blacked out. When I woke up, I saw my girlfriend also lying face down on the ground, just outside the cabin. We never made it to it. I panicked a bit and approached my girlfriend. When she woke up, she screamed, scaring me. "Leave us alone!" I was surprised, and I took a step back. I asked what was wrong, and she said that a man had been following us from the very beginning. What? I looked at her face and saw how pale she was. She looked very frail and sickly. With us scared, and now possibly in danger, I gave her a piggyback ride and carried her out of the forest as far as I could. We soon made it to the dirt road near my grandparents' house. When I put her down, I saw that no time had passed since we had first entered the forest. When we left, it was 11:38, but when we came back out of the forest, it was only 11:39. A single minute had passed, despite us walking over a kilometer back and forth. I called my uncle to come pick us up. A few minutes later, he showed up, and we rushed my girlfriend to the nearest hospital. When I told my uncle about our adventure, he got pissed and shouted that we were very, very lucky to come back alive. He said that some other people had tried to investigate that place, but many were hurt when they returned. Unfortunately, my friend actually got a permanent scar from the damage on her head after blacking out. We didn't do anything like this again for several years. Luckily, we're both alive and well now, but we won't be going back to any strange cabins. The Island in the Lake, from names James0933. Rachel, my fiancée, and I were on hour 17 into our drive to her family's cabin in northern Minnesota for a small vacation. I glanced at her with heavy eyelids to see that she was fast asleep in the passenger seat. The last 2 hours of the trip were spent through desolate back roads in towns that consisted of 100 people and a lone stoplight. I could feel myself immersing into the solitude as the roads began to be labeled by numbers instead of names. Finally, I turned onto the long stretch of road that winded through the forest and led to our destination, the cabin. Siri let me know there was 2 miles left. Then everything went back to silence. The car slowly trudged over the underdeveloped road as large chunks of gravel crunched and tumbled beneath the wheels, while towering pine trees loomed above us, blocking out any stars.
We arrived, and I was so exhausted that I considered just sleeping right there in the driveway. I'd never been to this cabin before, but upon first glance it was quite cozy. It's not one of those decked-out cabins that rich people buy, but it had 3 bedrooms and set just offshore to a small 1,100-acre lake. We quickly unloaded everything and collapsed onto a bed that smelled older than time. Though we were completely beat, we were excited to spend some time away from it all. The sun lit up our room early the next morning, and I was filled with a huge sense of relief when, out of routine, I checked my phone to see that there was no service. Nobody could bother us even if they tried. Rachel offered to drive to the nearest town to get some groceries, so I could settle in and check out the cabin myself. I rifled through hundreds of dusty books that sat on the shelves in the living room. Then I pulled out a dozen board games as I excitedly planned out our time ahead. I made my way outside and onto the dock that stretched out into the lake. A small boat lightly rocked in the water, and the dock creaked and groaned underneath my feet. I stared out at the lake and finally felt the last of my anxiety dissipate. As the drive to town was around half an hour, I figured I would set out on the lake to do some fishing. A small island caught my eye that sat close to the middle of the water. It was maybe 100 yards in diameter and was filled with dense trees and shrubs. Something about it drew me toward it. I can't really describe it, but it's like it slowly sucked me in. The island had an almost eerie glow about it, like it wasn't really in the same world as ours. I anchored maybe 50 feet from the shore and started casting. It wasn't 30 seconds after that I felt something hit my boat. I had nearly had whatever was on the line up to the boat. It must have gotten off the hook, I thought, hit the boat before swimming away. When I reached out to reapply the bait, I saw a fish dangling off the end of the line still. An uneasy feeling washed over me when I saw that it was completely mangled. It was nearly ripped in half with tears all along what was left of its body. My first thought was that a bigger fish must have jumped on it, but I didn't feel any sort of struggle that would indicate such. Maybe an otter, I thought, but again, I didn't feel a struggle when I reeled it in. I tried to ignore this and moved on to the opposite side of the island, resuming my fishing. But again, the next thing I hooked suddenly stopped fighting. I pulled up another shredded fish carcass. This happened a few more times as I was just curious at this point as to what was happening. I looked toward the island and felt such dread, like the island itself had eyes and was staring me down. I slowly rowed myself away to another spot closer to the cabin and started to catch some actually intact fish, all the while taking brief glances at that island. After hauling in a decent-sized bass, I heard Rachel pull into the driveway, so I decided to make my way back and try to forget about this experience. Over dinner, I casually brought up the island to Rachel. "So I saw there was this island in the middle of the lake. Have you ever been to it?" I asked. "Oh, that? Nah, my dad always just told us to not go over there. He said the land is still owned by the family of some woman who used to live there," she responded. "Wait, someone used to live there? How?" I asked. "Yeah, he said that there was a woman who had a house there. She owned some knick-knack shop in town till around 50 years ago, when she died. She'd have to row to the dock every morning just to get to her car," she explained. "Must have been a pain in the butt to get groceries there," I said with a laugh. "Yeah, my dad said she was super creepy, and they would sometimes catch her staring at them from the shore while they fished," she elaborated. "Well, that's just weird," I said, kind of laughing it off. "Yeah, but I'm pretty sure none of it was real. I think he just told us those things to keep us from going to the lake and messing around," she said with a laugh of her own. The rest of the day was spent playing various board games, reading, and just lounging around the cabin. However, each time I passed the living room window, I felt that distinct feeling of being watched. Each time I would glance out to see that island looming in the distance. Curiosity was starting to nag at me, especially now that I was told that there was a house sitting by itself, probably untouched there for decades. A few days passed by, and we spent our time doing more of the same. While relaxing like this was exactly what I needed. I couldn't get my mind off of that island. I had barely done any fishing since I did my first trip on the lake, as I always felt like something just didn't want me there. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided that once Rachel fell asleep, I was going to row out there to check it myself. It probably was just some urban legend her dad had concocted to scare the kids. But part of me wanted to know if it was real, wanted it to be real. I sat up in bed reading, waiting for Rachel to fall asleep. She fell asleep faster than anybody I'd ever met, and could sleep through a hurricane, so I knew I wouldn't have to wait too long. She really wasn't a fan of anything creepy, and going to an abandoned house in the middle of the night was not something she'd be interested in. But I did feel kind of bad doing this without telling her. Then again, I knew she would just protest if she knew. I grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight, a hunting knife just in case, and my phone to record anything noteworthy. Rachel was asleep within minutes of laying her head down, and after waiting maybe 20 just to be safe, I turned out the lights and quietly made my way out of the cabin. It was dead quiet outside as I made my way down to the dock. No frogs, no crickets, nothing making a sound that night. I pushed off the dock and rowed my way toward the island. Each dip of the oars into the water seemed so loud in the complete silence of the night. I was so anxious to see if Rachel's dad's stories were true or just legend. Either way, there was something off about this island, and I desperately wanted to see it for myself. I pulled up to it and circled around for a minute. The moon was bright enough for me to see the shoreline as I scanned for any spots that were clear enough for me to set anchor. Finally, I spotted a stump jutting out from the land that was partially submerged. The boat drifted towards it as I grabbed a hold and hoisted myself onto the land. I tied the rope to the stump, and after making sure it was secure, I clumsily stepped through the thick brush until I made my way onto what appeared to be someone's yard. I switched on my flashlight to see a disheveled home sitting in the very middle of the island. It stood 2 stories, with rotting walls and a caved-in roof. No way, I thought to myself. There really is a house here. All of the windows were broken, and the entirety of the house was suffocated by an overgrowth of ancient vines. The trees were so dense around it that it blacked out the sky above as this house stood, forgotten by time. I remembered to pull out my phone right then, to capture anything I might find. I swept the beam of light over the house after I hit record, then I made my way over. My feet crunched on fallen, dead branches and leaves. That sense of dread returned to me with a vengeance. I'd come this far, and I was not going to turn back now. I shined the light on the front door that sat ajar. I shone the light through the openings where the windows used to be, and it was eerie to say the least. Whoever lived here really must have owned a knick-knack shop or something, because dozens of miscellaneous items were strewn across the floor, coated in years of thick dust. A box spring mattress looked as if it had been thrown across the room as it sat partially upright against a decaying wall. I put my weight into the door, and it agonizingly creaked open, letting out decades of neglect. The air was dense and unforgiving as I swept my phone all around to record all these long-forgotten memories. Dozens of various trinkets, household tools, and ceramic animals covered the floors as I carefully stepped over the abandoned piles. I shifted the light to one corner of the room and felt my heart jump where I saw a pile of maybe a dozen baby dolls lying in a heap. I made my way towards them as the floor creaked and groaned. I was seriously starting to get the creeps as I noticed it was significantly colder in the house than it was outside in the summer night. Some of the dolls were missing their heads, while others had dirty and torn clothing on them. Right above the pile, I noticed a picture hanging on the wall. I blew off the thick coat of dust and went into a coughing fit as it blew directly back into my eyes and down my throat. When I came to, I saw it was one of those creepy old-timey photos of a family where no one was smiling, just vacant expressions staring back at me. There was a 30-something-year-old woman holding a baby with 2 little boys sitting by her sides. I realized they were standing in front of the house that I was currently invading. I turned around and my blood ran cold. Standing at the opposite edge of the room in a doorway was a small boy lit up in the beam of my flashlight. I jumped out of my skin and screamed as the light illuminated this figure. He was maybe 7 or 8 years old, with sandy blonde hair and deep brown eyes. The light in his face didn't seem to bother him as he stared straight through me. I quickly recognized his face as one of the boys in the photograph. "Sir, what are you doing here?" The words slithered out of his mouth and up my spine, sending a cold chill throughout my body. I sat there dumbfounded as I stammered at the ghostly figure. "Can you help my brother? Please, sir," the boy requested of me. I was speechless. He quickly turned and darted into the room behind him. I stood there for a moment, but then I realized I had all of this on video and I was seeing dollar signs. This was the most incredible and terrifying thing I'd ever witnessed. I took a deep breath, made sure the phone was still recording, and made my way into the room. I passed through the doorway and into a room that looked pristine. Clean floors, painted walls, and wooden rocking chairs. It even appeared that night had turned back into day, as the room looked dimly lit in the early morning light. I spotted yet another child off in the corner, just sitting on the floor, looking away from me, while the one who urged me into the room was leaning over something wrapped up on a couch. I made my way over to him, then glanced over his shoulder to see a baby cuddled up in a blanket cocoon. "He feels cold, sir. He hasn't made a sound in a long time, and we don't know what's wrong," the little boy said to me with sadness in his voice. The other child began rocking nervously, hands clenched around his legs as he formed into a little ball. "Can you help us, sir?" the boy pleaded. The rocking child began to whimper and mumble under his breath. "I'm sorry, I don't know what I can do to help," I spoke to him. "Is your mother around? She can help you." It was at that moment that I heard a sound coming up from a staircase that I hadn't seen before. It started out very faint, but as the sound gradually grew, I could make out the heartbreaking sound of a woman crying. It persisted until it was a full-fledged wail that was ringing throughout the house. The boy rocking in the other corner quickly rose and sprinted out of the room. "You should leave, mister. She doesn't like visitors." At that moment, it was like something flipped a switch, and the once immaculate room was now dark and cluttered with disgusting furniture that was torn and rotting. The wailing from upstairs hadn't ceased, and I heard loud, vicious stomping on the floor right above me, rapidly, making its way to the staircase and starting the descent to the room I was in. I felt frozen in place. I shined the light down onto the couch to see a dirty, dust-caked doll lying there in a blanket. I looked back up at what sounded like a raging bull at the bottom of the stairs, then just stopped. So did the crying. I fell back and waited for what felt like hours for something to show itself. I tried to crawl backwards as my legs seemed to stop working. After what felt like an eternity, it started its way towards me, and my heart sank. Thud, thud, thud. Each pause between the steps was more suspenseful than the last. I sat there, hands shaking as my flashlight trembled with them. I tried to force myself to turn it off, but it was too late. I watched in horror as a figure dark as night with long wispy hair and gangly limbs lumbered into the room. It seemed to stop and face me for a moment, and I could feel tears running down my face. After a brief pause, it made its way to the couch. It looked down at the old doll and stroked its head with long, bony fingers. It let its face collapse into its hands, and it began sobbing once more. Same as before, it gradually grew louder and louder until it was nearly deafening. It picked up the doll and held it tight to its chest before letting out an ear-piercing scream of pure despair. I was somehow able to get enough of a grip and pull out my knife, but as I did, this thing's neck violently twisted towards me and postured up. It towered high above me as its head nearly grazed the ceiling. At last, my legs found the strength I needed, and adrenaline kicked in. I stopped the video and pocketed my phone before making a mad dash for the door. I heard rapid, heavy stomps close the distance instantly, and I felt a tremendous force knock me through the doorway that I'd been running through. I frantically looked up as my flashlight had fallen from my hands, but I could still make out the figure hurling itself through the beam of light, which was coming from the flashlight wherever it had landed. A symphony of screaming and crying was coming from this thing. It stood over me as it pinned me to the ground with immense strength. I managed to shake my arm free. I then attempted to slash at its face with the knife, but it grabbed my wrist with such force that I felt it was going to snap my arm. It clenched its cold hands around mine and slowly guided the knife down towards my stomach. I tried punching it with my now free hand as it slowly lifted my shirt and began running the blade down my abdomen. I screamed out in pain as it pierced my skin. I felt warm blood slide down my sides. My free hand frantically grasped for anything to use to defend myself with, when I felt it go over a large piece of broken glass. Without hesitating, I grabbed it and stuck the thing in its eye. It let out a horrible cry and fell off me as I managed to sprint out of the house and into the boat. I could hear it crying that same mournful wail as I pushed the boat off and made it back to the cabin. I pulled in and tied the boat down before sprinting up to the house, but when I opened the door, I heard a horrible sound. The same crying was coming from somewhere inside my cabin. It sounded muffled at first, but grew in volume as I approached our bedroom. I made my way to the door, and as I opened it, the crying stopped. All I saw was Rachel slumbering peacefully the way I'd left her. I checked the closets, checked under the bed, checked every room in the house, but could find no sign of anything out of the ordinary. I dove under the covers and curled up tightly next to Rachel, my body trembling in terror. I decided right there we were leaving the following day. I couldn't be here anymore. I don't know if it was exhaustion or the result of high adrenaline wearing off, but I somehow found sleep after cowering under the covers for a while. I had a dream, though. It was me walking to the shore of the island. I could see our cabin in the distance, a small candle in the living room providing it enough light to be seen. However, I had no control over my movements. Whatever I was actually seeing through looked down at the water, dove in, and began swimming furiously toward the cabin. All the way I screamed for it to stop, but it only gained speed. It climbed onto the dock and sprinted at an unnatural speed, the earth seeming to shake underneath its feet. It opened the door of the cabin, slowing its pace, carefully making its way through the living room, then down the hall. It stopped and looked right at the bedroom door. It creaked open the door and walked inside. There I was, sleeping like a baby. I watched its disgusting, monstrous fingers slowly reach down towards me before violently grabbing me by the throat. I jolted awake and immediately shook Rachel up. "We have to go now." "What?" she replied in a groggy tone. "Just start packing. We're leaving right now." I rushed her into the car and hastily threw everything I could find before speeding down the unpaved road and away from the place. Rachel groggily asked me what was wrong, but I couldn't seem to answer. I felt as though I was in shock, and I couldn't get any words to come out. It was then that I remembered the video. I'd recorded it all. I pulled out my phone and handed it to Rachel. "Go through the videos. Watch the most recent one," I told her. "I don't understand what I'm looking at here," she said in an exhausted voice before handing me the phone after watching for a few minutes. "What? Please, babe, just watch it through," I pleaded with her. She She mumbled something but was already asleep again. I didn't really care that she wouldn't see it now. I was just happy to be getting away from that place and back home. I stopped at a rest stop a few hours into the trip. The sun had just finished rising. After making a trip to the bathroom and grabbing a few sodas from a vending machine, I decided to take a look at the video myself. Either Rachel was just half asleep, or the video didn't come out clear like I'd hoped. I pulled open the video, and my heart sank. There was no house in front of me, just dense brush and a huge pile of bricks and wood, the remains of a home. I scrolled through 2 hours of footage of me just standing there, staring straight ahead at nothing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I scrolled through the video, and it was over 3 hours straight of me just standing there. I went to the end of the video before some movement finally caught my eye, because the end of the video consisted of me slowly pulling up my shirt, dragging a knife across my stomach, and grunting in pain, before I dropped the knife and sprinted back to the boat in a panic, making my way back to the cabin. For several hours of the drive, I just sat in silence, unable to comprehend what all had happened. Even when Rachel took over driving, I would not let myself fall asleep in fear of having another nightmare. I didn't want to tell her, and I hoped that she was too tired to even remember me showing it to her. After the long 17-hour drive was finally over, we started to unload our stuff from the car. Rachel was gathering up all of her things while I started to haul in the larger pieces of luggage into the home. I walked into the house and set down all the luggage I was carrying. I felt a sense of unease take over. The air was thick and heavy and the house was freezing cold. I reached for our doorknob to the bedroom and felt my heart sink. Just beyond the door, I could hear the faint sound of a woman sobbing.